Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Intrigue Explained, the show where two former Australian diplomats who now explain things for a living try to shine a light on international relations by basically just arguing about it in a manner that I think will just continue to grow more and more contentious and deeply personal over time. Joining me is someone with several federal arrest warrants, I can only assume, my intrepid co-host, John Fowler.
How dare you? What a slight to start off start off the podcast.
I didn't say in which country. There are certain countries from which an arrest warrant might be a blessing on your record.
Well, that's true. A badge of honor. That's true. It's fair enough. Let's say North Korea and Russia.
Yes. Speaking of arrest warrants, you're in the US, I presume. It's hard to keep track of where in the world you are at any given day. You seem to be sitting comfortably in your office, but I assume that is a green screen as you are waging pitched battles to try to liberate the former president from prison. Has civilization collapsed on the back of the indictment?
I really hoped we wouldn't mention him. One of the things I've always said to people who questioned my move to the US, not without reason, was that it's really overblown how much people care about this stuff in the day to day. Like, you can walk into a shop, or you can have neighbors who are completely different political spectrum to you, and then no one makes it a massive issue. The 100 people on the street in New York protesting his arrest, or the 500 people that are outside Mar-a-Lago, are really just the extreme of the extreme, but they're the ones who make the news coverage. Everyone else goes about their business, just like any other country, right?
Is this like a Twitter bubble thing where if you read Twitter, you just think that the entire nation is consumed with something?
I think that's exactly the dynamic that's going on. I think it's more of a 24/7 media bubble. I think it's bigger than just Twitter. It's kind of, if you tune into any kind of news channel, or even the New York Times yesterday was wall to wall coverage,
Hmm.
which again, understandable, because it is definitely news. Former US president first to be indicted, all of that kind of stuff. But the as you framed it, the pitch battles, the anger, the kind of vitriol that you'll every so often on Twitter you'll see a Walmart, iPhone video of someone losing their mind and beating someone up because they love Trump so much, or whatever, or they hate Trump so much. That's just not how things go.
So given that, would you say that it would be useful if someone were to create like a daily newsletter that summarized big stories like that at a volume that like a normal person could consume, John?
So, something that sort of cuts through all that noise and just gives you what you need to know. Is that what you're kind of talking about?
Yeah, maybe something that like was written by people with expertise in the subject matter that was like a little bit
Yeah.
fun, a little bit funny, but still insightful.
Well, a great idea. I'll get right on that. I'll try. I'll change International Intrigue to be that.
For those who haven't joined us before, that was the world's most contrived plug of the newsletter that really informs this show. It's called International Intrigue. John and his co-founders and his staff produce it every day, really, to drop into your inbox, and we really can't recommend it highly enough. It's what I read to prepare for shows like this and to pretend to be smarter than I really am, which isn't that hard, but intrigue's still useful.
That's the goal, is to make people appear smarter than they really are in front of their bosses or the general public, dinner party guests as well.
We,
Key
we are
demographic.
we are there to help you feign intelligence and just we are truly the Cliff's Notes of international relations.
Uh, exactly. What is it to be alive in 2023 if not to project knowledge and confidence above your actual abilities?
Oh, it's a
says
horrifying.
two white guys, by the way.
Yeah, I might just have that as a banner floating over the video recording of
Says
this.
two white
Yeah,
guys.
or just like record a loop of some voice pointing that out that just plays every 15 seconds over the podcast. Like we know,
Yeah,
we know.
just tap the sign.
Yeah, exactly. We're terrible, but we're self-aware about it. So on this week's episode, our big debate topic is all about the United Nations. It was spurred by the Russia taking up the presidency of the UN Security Council, which led a lot of people to go, "Wait, what?" And that doesn't seem right. And so, something that I wanted John and I to explore through the medium of yelling at each other is, okay, well, what are the pros and cons of having a belligerent in a position like being on the UN Security Council or being chair of the UN Security Council? Or what are the pros and cons of having a country with an incredibly dubious human rights record be on the Human Rights Council, for example? Um, I've been a UN delegate in the past. John has worked in diplomacy for much of his life. So we hope to bring a little bit of insider perspective on this and try to, as always, steelman the issues. But before we get to that, John, was there anything in Intrigue this week that you thought was particularly worth putting on people's radar, throwing something into the mix on?
Yeah, I think one of it's been going on for a little while now, obviously, but I think the biggest story that it's been covered, but I think warrants sort of a bit more of a chat is Finland's accession to NATO, which I think everyone will be aware of has happened now, and it officially happened on Tuesday of this week. And the final stumbling block or potential stumbling block was Turkey allowing or agreeing Finland to join NATO, and that happened late last week when the Turkish Parliament approved it. I think there's a couple of things to note here. One, the first obvious one being that now Russia has almost doubled its border with NATO. I'm intentionally using the active language there, saying Russia's done this because I do think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has
Oh yeah,
prompted this. If that had not happened, this would not have happened. So
Finland would
Russia
have. I mean,
has
there's literally a word called Finlandization, which literally
right.
refers to their not being in this sort of position, and now they are.
Yeah, and I think that's the key thing to note, right? Like it's that since Finland and Russia went to war in right at the start of World War II, and since then Finland has been assiduously careful to kind of maintain neutral relationships with Russia to make sure they don't piss Russia off, while kind of being a Western country. But obviously, Ukraine changed all that. So I mean, that's the first thing to note. Russia's doubled its border with NATO. It's kind of now about I think 3,000 kilometers long rather than 1,500 odd it was before, rough figures, which can only be interpreted, I think, as a huge own goal from the Kremlin. The giant galaxy strategic brains in the Kremlin who try to present that they know what's happening, 10 moves ahead. I think it's been shown up by that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I know we say this a lot, but they are so bad at statecraft. It is remarkable. Just the sheer volume of own goals that they have kicked in the last couple of years, one after the other, to effectively just alienate every potential ally, move a lot of people in the neutral column into the potential adversary column, fail to utilize their leverage. It's incredible to watch in
Mm,
in the like, when you have a field and you're not quite sure if it makes a difference if you're good at it or not. You're just like, oh, maybe just stuff just happens. Like, oh, no.
right.
Like, diplomacy is hard and some people really suck at it, and this is what that
And it's
looks
only
like.
Exactly. It's noticeable when it goes poorly rather than when it goes well. It's like
Yeah.
it's most clearly like, oh, I see why it matters now because this kind of stuff happens when you are terrible at it.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's that surprising that Russia's terrible at it. I mean, their whole you know state apparatus is designed around security and bravado and military and anger and bloodshed and everything, and has been since well, let's just be generous and say at least since the kind of Georgian wars in the 2008 or whenever that was. So it really isn't surprising to me, but it can only be seen as an own goal. And I think it's interesting to sort of say that I think let's after the fall of the wall of the Berlin Wall, Russia and Finland had that relationship I alluded to, where it was kind of like Russia was like, we see a friend or at least a partner we can work with in Finland. Don't join NATO because that would make us see you as an enemy. They threatened blood and thunder if they joined NATO at the start of the Ukraine war. They've joined NATO despite the threats. Russia's tried to downplay the fact that they've joined NATO. It was like, guys, we meant this the whole, like, we knew this was going to happen. It's no big deal. But you can kind of see that there's a lot of like rhetoric coming out of Russia now of like, oh, it's a huge threat. But I think they'll be pretty keen to like pretend it never happened.
Yeah, and it just, again, it kind of comes back to so much of the commentary around Russian statecraft and Russian actions is we tend to blow them up as hyper competent in our own minds, in part because there is kind of a faction in our own politics that likes to contrast them as hyper competent with what they see as an incompetent or weak West. And I think it's useful to get these reminders that actually often these guys screw up massively because they're just not that good at this and not nearly as
Right.
smart or capable as we think they are.
Yeah, and I do think it's important that you kind of assume that your enemies do know what they're doing, because the opposite is complacent and lazy and ends up in being things like what Russia did to Ukraine, being like, oh, they're idiots, they don't know what they're doing,
Yeah.
invade, whoopsie daisy, we're the ones who are the idiots. But anyway, I
Yeah.
think the last thing I wanted to note was I read a headline in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, which basically just said this. And the reason I guess I wanted to flag it as something that's worth a bit more investigation is that this opinion piece in the journal said that it's Finland joining NATO, because Finland has a huge army, right?
Yeah.
Given its size, because of the threat of Russia over the last 50, 60, 70 years, it's developed a really effective, really, elite modern fighting force that you wouldn't expect from a friendly northern Scandinavian country. And the journal said basically it's the last comparable boost to Western security in terms of like ability, firepower, what they bring to the table, was when West Germany joined the West in 1955. So that kind of gives you some perspective on how big a deal this really is for NATO. They haven't just added, no disrespect to Lithuania, but they haven't just added like a tiny minnow European country. This is a country that packs a punch.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Finns take security incredibly seriously. They have a massive artillery force. The only time in the last century a Finn has smiled is when that White Death sniper was racking up his like 57th Red Army kill. Like this is a really serious country that brings a hyper competent military force into NATO. Now, of course, it is worth saying any direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia would, on the conventional side, we now realize would be an absolute whitewash to NATO because the Russian army is incompetent and struggling to defeat Ukraine, but would escalate to nuclear arms and probably lead to the end of the world. So, how much does this really change reality on the ground? Not so much, but I think it's clear. Did Russia want Europe's largest artillery force now in an Article 5 alliance to defend other NATO powers on its border? No, it did not, and now it's happened. And I think it's big. So I think, yeah, it's a big story, and it's getting the coverage it deserves, I think.
Agreed. All right. Well, given that you're an equally avid reader of International Intrigue, what stood out for you from our, say, last 5 or 6 days of coverage? Is there any story that you think deserves extra mention?
Yeah, so this is something you folks teased and you wrote that it was happening, but I think you're still in the process of doing a deeper dive. And that is the French president's visit to Russia. It's literally kind of happening as we speak. And it jumped out at me for a bunch of reasons, but mostly because I think it highlights the really weird place we're in vis-a-vis kind of whether you want to call it a new Cold War, these tensions between the West and China, in that we are clearly not yet at the point of kind of truly Cold War politics where any kind of engagement is verboten. And especially Europe, while increasingly expressing concerns about China, certainly wants to keep one foot in the cordial relations camp. And for me, this kind of visit sort of is emblematic of that.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the hullabaloo around it really does suggest that we are in a different, that this is not normal, in the sense that this is not like, if President Macron visited India, would it have made intrigue? Would we be talking about it? Would
Well,
we be
I think
debating
he
it?
did last. I think he did late last year, if I'm not massively incorrect. And it wasn't a massive. I mean, it was a story, of course, but it
Yeah,
wasn't a
but
massive story.
whereas kind of directly interacting with Xi is seen like a real geopolitical event. So I think that for me just kind of emphasized even our reaction to it, emphasized
Mm,
the kind of place we're in. I also think he's copping some flack. I think his line to Xi on the Ukraine war was something, and I'm paraphrasing here, was I know I can trust you to bring Russia to the table and help us resolve this peace. Something to that effect. And he's been slammed as naive for saying that. He's been
mm.
attacked. And I don't consider myself a dove on the Ukraine issue by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't think I was allergic to it as other people were. And I'm interested in your take.
Yeah, I think everything you've just said is absolutely right. I think it's in. I think also the thing to mention too is that it's always good to have multiple countries, Western countries, presenting the same argument and not just the US. The China has
Hmm.
spent a lot of time domestically vilifying the US, so there isn't a lot of credibility in the US, in China, about what the US has to say. Like if this was a message delivered by Blinken or Biden, I think it would be, the Chinese state media would have almost no choice but to kind of discount it a bit.
Hmm.
China still wants to work with Europe, wants to work with France, sees them as more amenable to China's interests. So I think it's important that this a very similar message, i.e., don't send arms to Russia. Ukraine war is Russian aggression. It has to stop, but it can't. The peace can't be on Russian terms. All these kinds of messages, which China won't agree to necessarily, but
Hmm.
hearing it from a bunch of different countries, some of which it wants to have productive relationships with, I think is helpful. And then I think the second thing that I found interesting is that Macron is going through some difficult times back at home, right?
Hmm.
In the lead up to the election, late last year. Well, it might have been over the summer last year. He made a big push to try and present himself as the negotiator between Russia and the West, which a lot of people saw as kind of his attempt to rise above the fray of domestic politics, to kind of de Gaulleify himself as this kind of international statesman who was above the fray of French political kind of machinations. We know that the protests this year have gone pretty badly for Macron in terms of his popularity at home. So there's an element. I don't think it's the driving element, but there's an element that his kind of statesmanship is an effort
Hmm.
to rebuild his image. So yeah, but I think you're exactly right. It's a big story. We haven't covered it yet because we haven't seen what's come out of it. I think he's still there giving speeches and all that kind of stuff. And we always like to give these news topics a couple of days of air to breathe, like a fine wine, so that we can try and pull out some of the deeper threads rather than just being like, oh my god, he gave this speech. Oh my god, he did this. So yeah.
Waiting to find out if this story is corked. Uh,
Well, yeah, exactly right. It's a good analogy.
uh, I will say though, I think again in Macron's defense, and I think to back up something that you said earlier, um, the only way this war ends, um, it is Putin eventually deciding to end it. And it's about how many things can you stack onto the equation, encouraging him to do so. And there's an element of sanctions to that. There's an element of Ukraine taking back territory and, frankly, just really mauling the Russian army to that. There's domestic pressure, and then there is international pressure. And China seems to be about the only actor where you can conceivably see they say something and he at
They
least
have sway. Oh,
seriously considers
100%.
it.
Well, I mean,
Uh,
Russia is a junior little partner to China now, so he's the kind of almost like a vassal, but not quite. I think that one last point I wanted to make too is that there's the centrality of Beijing to this, which is what they want, right? Beijing
mhm,
wants to be like, you come to us and pay us tribute, and we decide who we tell, what we tell, what messages we tell to. But Saudi Arabia, I've got the Financial Times open right
mhm,
now, and Saudi Arabia and Iran are holding a meeting in Beijing, at this very moment, while Macron is presumably there, or he may have just left. But this is the idea that everyone's coming to Beijing to kind of court their influence, because they are probably the only one, the only credible country now of significant power that can talk to Russia, that can talk to Europe, that can kind of thread that needle. Now, I don't think that means that they're going to be a credible negotiator when it comes down to it, but it's clear that they are positioning themselves as that kind of keystone in world affairs.
Yeah, and I think honestly, in some ways, that's quite a positive potentially, because it is one thing to have people come to Beijing, but then the expectation is that they have constructive talks while they're there that lead to outcomes. If the criticism that a lot of people were leveling against China historically was, you don't like the role of the US in the world order, you don't want a US-led world, but when are you going to step up and demonstrate some genuine leadership? And if the incentives are for some sort of constructive leadership for China, that is better than a purely, one could argue, that is better than merely kind of negative incentives to just criticize what the West is doing and stir trouble in the US-led order. This is me trying to gild the lily.
I was gonna say, in my case, that's very much a careful what you wish for, because I
Yeah.
don't know that anybody with well, I mean, I shouldn't say this. I have my views on China, but there is as equally a strong case to say that China isn't necessarily the best faith negotiator in this stuff, and will always be trying to seek its own advantage. Which, that's the nature of international relations. It's the way it goes.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think on that question of the nature of international relations, and since we are already basically debating, it's time to segue to our main topic for the podcast, which is, should bad actors be allowed on UN bodies? Now, I want to set this up just a tiny bit. As I said, we decided to talk about this because Russia, on I think Monday, took up the chair of the UN Security Council, of which they are a permanent member, which led to some raised eyebrows around the world. As always with one of these things, we will each take a side of this debate, not necessarily the side that we 100% agree with. I think both John and I are reflexive cowards who caveat everything we say with 37.
That's true.
Well, on balance,
diplomatic habits die hard.
Exactly. Exactly. You will never find out what we actually believe in, and we like it that way. But we will do our very, very best to present both sides of the case as strongly as we possibly can to arrive, hopefully, at some elucidation. I will also say that one thing I wanted to move off the table for this is the legal feasibility of removing a bad actor. Because I don't think that necessarily, just the fact that there is no legal architecture to remove a bad actor doesn't necessarily mean they should be there. And I think it is worth exploring as a philosophical question and a political question whether it is good for these countries to be there or not, without kind of getting into like, well, what are the mechanisms? Because in most cases there are none. But, maybe if people felt strongly enough, they could, we'll start our own casino with blackjack. And, there are ways and ways.
You're right. It's a separate question that I think is a very interesting one, but not necessarily, not necessarily productive for a conversation more about, as you said, like, it's almost like the political, what we're trying to tease out in this conversation is the political justifications and the almost like the moral authority that the UN has if it does or doesn't include Russia in these kinds of forums, I guess.
Yeah. We're going to focus a bit on the UN Security Council and the Human Rights Council, but really I think you could extend this argument to a lot of bodies. Should massive polluters be on UN environmental bodies? Like, there's the UN is big and filled with sin, much like myself on both counts.
I thought you were going to pivot to the casino reference there, but you went the self-deprecating route.
Well, nice. I tread the road I know. So for this one, John is going to defend these states remaining on these bodies. and I am going to attack him with all the righteousness I can muster, and perhaps throw in some logic as a bonus. Is there anything you wanted to say by way of opening remarks?
No, I think it's up to you to make your case that that countries like Russia. I mean, and we're going to focus on Russia because it's the thing that's
Mhm.
happening right now. But I mean, it could apply equally to arguments against any country violent. You know, Syria, if it was rotating through the Security Council when it was, you know, gassing and killing its own people, or you know, there's any number of things this could apply to. But I think make your case that Russia shouldn't be on I mean, it's also a P5 member. We should say
Yeah.
to folks listening, like it's a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It has a veto, so it really has an outsized influence on what the Security Council, what the UN can achieve. So why don't you tell me why you think they should be booted off or at least removed?
Sure. So I think I'll be making an argument in kind of three different streams of argument here, until we inevitably get sidetracked and start arguing about something else.
Yeah, I was
But
going to say we spent 4 minutes setting it up and then 1 minute arguing like we planned to, and then just like rabbit
yeah,
holes.
they're just fighting about something. So basically, I think about these issues in a optics and perception bucket,
Mm.
a moral and ethical bucket, and a kind of effectiveness of the system bucket. And those all kind of overlap. These are sort of, I recognize these aren't going to be clean divisions, but I thought I'd throw these at you one at a time and just get your reaction.
Hmm.
So let's start with optics and perception because let's face it, that's what runs the world. So the UN, this is my pitch. The UN not generally empowered to do all that much in terms of what is the UN's general kind of its strongest card to play. I would argue that the moral authority and global leadership of the UN, it's probably the biggest arrow in its modest quiver. Most of the time, it can't really deploy troops. It's not itself authorized to do too many sanctions. But what it can do is a bully pulpit kind of approach to saying this is not right. And we, the international community, say it's not right. This is especially true, I think, in bodies like the Human Rights Council, which have virtually no kind of enforcement
Yeah.
authority, but is also true, I think, in the Security Council and other places. For me, that is completely undermined when you have belligerents in a conflict that are either on these bodies or, chairing these bodies. How can the UN Security Council, setting aside Ukraine, how can a UN Security Council that is chaired by Russia look at any other conflict in the world and credibly say to another belligerent country, stop doing that? It is contrary to international law. It is a violation of the UN Charter when Russian tanks are streaming across the border.
Yeah, so I mean, it's obviously a fair point. I think the way I would argue that it does actually increases its moral authority is that it says the system is bigger, the broader system, the architecture is bigger than any single event. And as horrific as, I mean, I don't think anybody sits there being like, oh well, because now that the chairman of the Security Council, the UN has sanctioned what's going on in Russia, in Ukraine. I don't think that's a moral risk. No one thinks it's okay. But if you start reacting based on events and you know horrific events, and you start to unpick the rules of the game, you lose the moral imperative that the UN isn't just a tool for Western oppression slash control of the global system. So the analogy that I kind of tend to make is a court of law, right? You can have a serial murderer, horrific person in front of a court of law that everyone knows is guilty and everyone thinks them is just appalling. But the court itself doesn't lose its moral authority to make a judgment by listening to the case, by having them have a lawyer in front of the court making full-throated arguments in their defense. It actually gains its moral imperative because you say, no matter what the situation is, the rules of the game are what are important. The system is what's important. And yes, it's appalling and it leads sometimes to outcomes that we don't like. but that is far better than the might makes right, the dog eat dog world that would exist without this.
Yeah, but I mean, sure, we give people their day in court, but we don't put the accused on the bench. We don't put them in the
But I don't.
jury pool, you know?
But I think but if that was the system, then we would, right? The system is that they get a full throated defense. The system is that the chairman of the UNSC rotates, and just because there's a situation right now that's going on that's horrific, you don't be like, oh, okay, yeah, but that rule doesn't apply to you because we don't agree with what you did. And also, let's remember that a lot of the world doesn't treat Ukraine as appallingly, view it as terrible as the West necessarily does. There are huge swathes of Africa that would go, they got kicked off for that. My God, like what will happen if, you know, and anything else that we do? There's this sense of like, you really can't, I don't think that the whole point of the UN is rules that last through time and are meant to be, not ideal. They don't deal with every situation properly, but they provide stability and structure. And you immediately have a situation now where like, yeah, except for when we don't like it, except for when we think it's a bit upsetting and we don't like the moral look of the UN, of Russia chairing the UNSC, which no doubt it's a terrible optic, but it would be worse to chop and change the rules because of that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you could make the argument that the rules are kind of flawed. The rules were
For
flawed to
sure.
begin with. So it sounds like what you're
Well,
saying is
well,
what would be
why
a
not China for
problem is if we
Xinjiang?
suddenly.
Yeah, why not the US for Abu Ghraib, for Guantanamo, for the Iraq War, the unsanctioned Iraq War? Why not the French for nuclear testing? Why not the UK for everything? It's just there's a sense of like, and I really don't. I want to be careful not to downplay the seriousness of the Ukraine war, but I do think there is a sense, and again, take this in the spirit I intend it, of it being the current thing. These countries, the P5 and many countries around the world, how can you measure the horrificness that's going on in Ukraine against what the Iraq War was, or what's gone on in multiple countries around the world, Xinjiang, these kinds of things? How can you measure them? How can you compare them? You can't. So I do feel like if you kick Russia off, then you may as well just really say that everyone has to be kicked off, or you're biased, or you're clearly saying that this isn't a system that works as a global body of leadership, designed to make decisions. It is a Western controlled thing, and then when we don't like it, you play by our rules, which fair enough.
All right, I want to move on to the kind of moral and ethical side of this because I want to call you a monster a bunch of times and have it be on the permanent record. But
You'll have to take a ticket and form a queue.
it's just one of many. I'll go to the UK. They love queuing. To push back on what you've just said a tiny bit, first of all, I do think you could make the case on the Ukraine question, specifically in that a invasion for territorial conquest is so quintessentially what the UN was set up to try to prevent that I do think it is qualitatively and quantitatively different to countries committing atrocities on their own territory, for example. Not morally different necessarily, but structurally different in terms of the rules of international relations and just how contrary it is to the fundamental nature of the UN Charter. So I won't make that case on kind of that one narrow
But
point.
that's a very it's very limited, right? Like you've got a conception there of like invasion and occupation in a physical sense, because otherwise then you've got to say, well, America has invaded Iraq with the express goal of regime change, Afghanistan with the express goal of regime change, and the only difference between arguably the only difference between what Russia's doing in Ukraine and what those two invasions were about were, one, we agreed with the principle that terrorism is bad because we're in America or we're in the West, and two, there's some sense that America didn't want it to like add it to its colonial possessions. But I mean, that's a very fine distinction when you sit there and say they were in Afghanistan for 20 years, but they didn't want to be. So that's the difference.
Yeah, and to be clear, I think it would be entirely rational for someone to go something like the Iraq War, which was expressly not condoned by the UN, could potentially have been grounds for removal as well.
No.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Could have been grounds for removal, and I think there would have been a case to make in that regard. I will also just slightly push back on this sort of it's just the West. Every UN vote on the Iraq war goes like 140-29 in terms of
Ukraine
condemning
war.
the invasion. Sorry, the Ukraine war goes
Yeah.
140-29. So there isn't, this isn't just sort of the US,
But
and this isn't an OECD
held that
thing.
vote, right? But if you had that held that vote to kick Russia off the UNSC, I think it'd be a very different number.
That's true. I think that I would readily concede, but I think at that point, in part because it would be this kind of unprecedented situation. What I mean, I
And I think
suspect.
so. The final point there is, I think by doing it, you undermine the whole system, right? Like that's my point. It's like I don't disagree with you that it's a terrible look, but you do undermine the whole system because then you do have to kick off the US, or you're a hypocrite, and then you do have to kick off China, or you're a hypocrite, and then what's the point in having the system? Let's all just go back to the good old days where no one talked to anybody and we didn't try to achieve anything.
Yeah, I think there
Anyway,
are. Yeah, I do think it's something that really important for people to understand about international relations is that, especially when it comes to issues like human rights and international security, you simply have to accept some level of hypocrisy because otherwise no one would be able to criticize anyone ever. The entirety of sort of it would be I don't know who's got no skeletons in their closet. Some certainly have more, but there is this kind of assumption where someone can
Costa
be
Rica seems pretty
hypocritical.
okay.
Like
No army.
Lesotho's doing all right. Like I don't know. It's just like
No, it's a fair point.
Norway since the Viking. I don't know. Um,
Oil.
yeah, just having it. Just if you have oil, you're a
Exactly.
bad
Just
guy. Like that's how we
exactly
test.
these days.
Morality is just a drilling exercise, and if you strike black gold, you're a monster. It's really bad news for Texas. Um, what are you doing? I'm fracking for morality. Uh, s-
Yeah, no, it's a fair point though.
Speaking of morality, let me put this to you. This is kind of a moral argument I have seen made that I thought was that struck a chord with me, which is the UN is useless. And given that it is useless, it is objectively cruel that we have this spectacle where the victims of something like the Ukraine invasion are forced to sit there and listen to the chairman of the UN Security Council babble on about biolabs, call them all Nazis, and say they were begging for it. That it is just an objectively monstrous thing that we are subjecting people to. It is a subversion of everything good and right. And we are doing it in defense of a system that has proven ineffective in facing massive challenges.
I mean, again, I won't win any friends by saying this. When I agree with you entirely that it's incredibly nasty to give Russia a bully pulpit to,
Mhm.
propagate their lies and hate around, from a place that has a lot of moral authority, at least optically. But that's the way things go, and I am resistant to making giant changes to structures and organizations based on, and I mean this again with good faith, but based on how awful it makes people feel. I, you know, it, there, I reject the idea that this kind of stuff leads to more harm, like encourages other countries that, oh, we can get away with it. I don't think it does anything more than, it's a very, very awful situation for people to be in, but like that is the way the world works. It is a brutal place and it is a nasty place, and like if we start to transpose what I would argue are some fairly I'll be careful here, but like some ideas that like you are designed that you're allowed to have a safe space in international relations, then I don't know where that ends,
Whoa,
because like
Ben
if you sit there,
Shapiro!
not quite
What?
that bad,
Just
but
just because we're a debate podcast doesn't mean you can go all manosphere on me.
but the idea that the UN Security Council is a place where you go in and you don't have any kind of awful words and ideas and people like that, then you're not engaging with the world. That's as simple as that. So what is the point of it? Like, again, I'm not saying that this is like, it's not okay for Russia to be doing this. It's not a good outcome, but sometimes these things lead to outcomes you don't like. And if you throw out the baby with the bathwater, if you decide to undermine the validity of the whole institution based on individual outcomes that you don't like, and they can be horrific like this, then you may as well not have the UN at the whole time. Like, I really do think the analogy between a law court and this is the one that I kind of come back to, because it's like, you, like, just because you saw someone do it and they're guilty, they still get a trial. Just because Russia has invaded Ukraine and they're horrific, they still become the chairman of the UNSC and they still get to say that stuff, because that's how the system works. If you want to get rid of the system, that's another question, right? And what we're talking about, and I guess what the link that I'm making is that if you kick Russia off, if you remove Russia for this kind of stuff, you are undermining the whole system. And I think the system loses a lot of its efficacy, such that it has any, and it really you accelerate its already pretty rapid decline. What comes next? You better have a solution for, we're going to kick Russia off. Yes, we think the UN's outdated. It doesn't have any, meaningful solutions. It leads to these horrible things where it gets to talk to the victims like this. But what comes next?
I think before I kind of dig into that effectiveness of the system and is the system valid question, I did want to sort of switch hats for a moment and add something to what you're saying, which is, I guess the counter argument is that while it is horrific that the Russian chairman gets to read his awful statement, he then has to sit through somewhere between
exactly.
12 countries being like, listen, totally. And that is also, that could conceptually be of some value if there was evidence that Russia gave a damn about anything. Not clear that they do, but perhaps others do.
It's about every other country. Yeah. It's about every other country seeing a unified, somewhat unified world being like, very good, you've had your term, now sit down and shut up, because the rest of the world thinks you're monsters. And that's far more powerful than being like, don't speak, you can't, like, we're going to blow up the system to get rid of you because we don't want you to even have a word. Like, allowing them to have that word and then having a broadly unified rebuke, I think, is far more powerful.
Yeah, I think there's certainly something to the argument that having a series of votes in the UN General Assembly go against them by massive margins, seeing them not even able to muster unified BRICS abstentions, let alone kind of votes in their favor, undermine their ability to claim that the only ones who support Ukraine are the Western coalition. I think there is something to that argument. Who wanted
to wage war against them, exactly, yeah.
Okay, last thing I want to run by you, the kind of effectiveness argument. Now, in terms of stopping wars that have started and sort of punishing injustice, the UN's record isn't great, but the few times it has managed to do things have been, you could argue, the Korean War, where there was able to be a UN intervention because Russia happened to be boycotting the UN that week. In, again, another just truly, I mean, it was Soviets, but a true masterstroke of statecraft. Going back to our earlier comment, just true genius to boycott the thing you have a veto in as it is voting on a thing you really don't want to happen. Well played.
Well, to be fair, they learned from that mistake.
Yeah. It only took one multi-year war. And then the first Gulf War was another example where it just proved that Saddam Hussein just appeared to have no friends whatsoever. It was just a true global pariah. His invasion of Kuwait just left him completely isolated, and so the UN was able to act. Could you make the argument, therefore, that yes, kicking off bad actors, even doing it, especially doing it hypocritically, would leave the UN as a puppet of a much smaller, as kind of the body of a much smaller body of powers, perhaps Western dominated, but often that's the only time it's going to get to do anything.
Yeah, but I mean that. Yes, so like, is effectiveness good here? I mean, again, like a vigilante group is probably more effective at killing criminals, but that's not the way we decide to organize our societies, because that
If we gave
it's
criminals a
amoral and
veto, if we gave criminals a veto in court, Batman would be a far more attractive prospect. Or at least the Justice League.
well,
I don't know.
that's that's true enough. But to your effectiveness, I mean, I think both of those examples you used are as much products of the historical context as any example of UN power. I think the first Gulf War was the end of history, right? Right around this kind of maelstrom of USSR falling apart and China being very very weak. And then a very clear violation of sovereignty. It was a very different situation. I think if that happened again now, it would be a completely different result. Not because of the facts changing on the ground, but because of the political dynamics changing. But I think when it comes to effectiveness, the UN has never been an effective body in terms of getting things done. That's not really its purpose. Maybe it's what it was sold at, and maybe what you learn in international relations 101. But its purpose, as you alluded to at the very start, in my view, is its moral authority, is its inclusiveness, is its ability to take the temperature of a broad swathe of the globe that largely gets forgotten in great power politics. And when it makes a decision, or when it does get its limited things done, it carries a great moral authority because it is the collective decision of the world, essentially. So then it makes to me, again, it's a feature, not a bug, that it isn't very effective at going to war. It isn't very effective at doing things that are deep. I mean, it's a fundamentally conservative institution by nature because big changes shouldn't be made very often, I guess, is the argument I would make. So if you kick out Russia, you kick out, let's say in your hypothetical, it becomes a far more Western dominated, or even Chinese dominated, or one bloc dominated organization. It becomes essentially just like a regional alliance that is going to prosecute its national interests, and it loses all its moral authority and just becomes a powerful tool to affect one country's or one bloc's views. And that's not what the UN is. The UN was really conceived to be a global voice and decision-making forum, such to the extent they can make decisions, but at least they get to have a conversation. So it wouldn't be the UN, right? You might be called the UN, but it would be
NATO
like
plus
the Allies, or
yeah,
exactly. NATO's it would be NATO, really.
Yeah. I think that's sort of a good place to begin summing up. Really,
Well,
which is
I just one more point. Sorry, I mean, you'll have to work hard to shut me up on this one. It's an interesting topic to me, but I think the other thing that we're kind of glossing over intentionally is that a lot of the UN's work is in the spaces that no one gives a shit, right? Like it's the unified standards for SMS text messaging across borders, and like how we're going to manage satellites, and like all this kind of like stuff that no one cares about. That if you didn't have that hierarchy, that overarching kind of global body, a lot of these like actually are boring but very very crucial, almost like logistical link up questions wouldn't be solved because they wouldn't have people in the room to be able to solve them, if you get my point.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important point to flag here, which is you can't talk about this in a vacuum. If you any scenario where we start kicking countries off the UNSC probably leads to them also storming out of the UN General Assembly, which leads to them storming out of the Universal Postal Union.
Right, and
suddenly
taking countries with them.
And taking countries with them. And so there is a technocratic and a keep the wheels on the bus argument to be made here that is separate from these kind of moral arguments about the UN as a thing that does a lot more than just global security and human rights.
Right.
Is an argument we haven't had time to explore.
No, and the distaste of having what you described as, Russia making statements and yelling and all that kind of stuff is almost the cost you pay to have at least functioning stuff out of the media glare that just gets on with it. At the end of the day, Russia's still a big part of the world with its, linkages to the rest of the world and its alliances or its friendships. And you kind of need those countries to play nice on the, as you said, the bureaucratic level. But anyway.
Yeah, I think that's for me, a lot of this comes down to this question of, do you think on the high level, on the Security Council, the Human Rights Council stuff, do you think the unpleasantness of having them there is justified by the value of having a system with any kind of credibility at all, or of an inclusive system. Like, are the conversations worth the unpleasantness is kind of the meta question. The second one
Right.
is this giant architecture, this giant intergovernmental architecture that we have built is quietly integral to so much of the world's function
Yes.
that is, even if you decided that you wanted to excise these kind of tumors on the body politic, to use an unpleasant metaphor, it would be very difficult without killing a bunch of the organs that aren't as problematic.
Yeah, I agree.
Is that a fair way to sum
That's a
up?
very fair summary, I think. I mean,
Yeah.
and again, you could talk about this for hours, and there's so many different takes, and but I think that's a fair summary.
I think where I would leave it is to say I completely understand people's frustration with the UN, in part because
Oh
it is
yeah, God.
you don't get to call yourself the UN Security Council and then just go, well, and then just tut at be vetoed tutting at an invasion of a country that violates the UN.
Yeah.
You sort of
I mean, it is absurd.
yeah. Whenever I see anybody sort of tweet the UN is completely useless, I tend to understand where that sentiment comes from, even if I do understand all of the counter arguments for why there isn't necessarily a path to a better alternative.
And it's analogous to that famous, I think it was Churchill quote, where it's like democracy is the worst system of government except for all the West. That the UN is the worst system of global government except there's none other.
There's none other, and there's never been any other. And we've
and realistically there won't be any others.
No,
not in our lifetimes, I don't think anyway.
Not until the chips that Bill Gates has put in all of our bloodstream activate and we fall into line.
AI global government.
Exactly. I would also, it's always useful to remind people we've only been trying to do global governance for, like, depending on how you count it, 100 years out of, I don't know, 10,000 years of recorded human history. We've never been able to come up with international structures or laws that can prevent a superpower, or really just a powerful country, from doing things it really wants to do. And so there is, unfortunately, an extent to which you have to grade the UNSC on a curve, which is they are trying to do something that's never been done before and wasn't done before for a reason, because it's really hard.
And has stopped a world war since the last one. 80 years of relative global peace. Obviously, there's horrific regional conflicts, but it was kind of set up to make sure those things never happened again. And on that curve, so far so good.
I also have this rock that's prevented tiger attacks on my home, John, and I will sell it to you.
Yeah. Good point.
For 5 Dogecoin. On that note, I think it's a good place to wrap up. Thank you so much for bearing with us on this episode of Intrigue Explained. We hope you found some of the discussion edifying and useful. As always, if you want to get back to us, we would absolutely appreciate your insights, ideas for topics we can debate next week.
Yeah.
God, it's hard coming up with them. John just agrees with me on everything. It's really difficult. I'll try to be less brilliant because it's really sapping our creative energy. We would love for you to recommend the podcast to others who might like it. And as always, sign up to the International Intrigue newsletter. It really is fantastic content in a much more concise format. And if you want more of a podcast fix, Intrigue Out Loud, hosted by International Intrigue's own Ethan, who comes with a absolutely silken radio voice, dives into issues
so often that I'm starting to have questions, Dmitry.
Listen, it's just the inadequacy just hits me every time I listen to an episode.
I know that feeling.
I just want to get one of those AI things where I can just type and Ethan's voice comes out. Really lends gravitas. No, we can't recommend it enough. Ethan and John dive into some of the International Intrigue topics, but then also Ethan conducts interviews with really fascinating people.
Hey, and tomorrow, so we're recording this on Thursday. Tomorrow we've recorded an interview with Dave Sharma, Dmitry, who you're aware of. Yeah, so Dave is, for those who don't know, he's a former Australian ambassador to Israel and federal politician, and it's a great conversation. He's a really top mind. So it's a good one. So you should all listen to that.
Did you have time to ask him? There was the basically, as we're recording this, Israel's been hit by a rocket attack and is retaliating.
Ah, really?
Yeah.
No, we didn't cover that. We recorded it a little earlier in the week, but that's something to watch.
Well, definitely cutting that from the podcast, guys. If only I had a producer I could yell at, but it's just me with a copy of Audacity. So thank you very much for listening. Please drop us a like and subscribe if you liked what you heard, and we will hear you next week. Thanks so much, everyone. I'm Dmitry, and with me is John.
Thanks, everyone.